I can say that our people, without being stupidly optimistic, are full of confidence and are absolutely resolved.
Let us then move forward together in discharge of our mission and our duty, fearing God and nothing else.
Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This week, as by-elections are pretty omnipresent in the news, in fact, one by-election in particular, we thought we'd look back at a really striking historic parallel to what's currently going on in Makerfield. In order to tee that up, it's probably worth saying that all of us, when we vote in general elections, we like to think that we're choosing the next Prime Minister. But of course, we're usually doing nothing of the sort, at least not directly. Instead, we're electing our own local MP, who we can reasonably expect to support the leader of their party to become the next Prime Minister. And yes, I should say there's an exception there for people who live in that person's own constituency who does get to vote for them. But as we're not a presidential but a parliamentary system, there's no guarantee that any one party leader is going to end up Prime Minister after an election, or even if they do, that they are going to remain there for very long. In fact, it's a little curiosity that the last Prime Minister to be elected and removed from office at general elections was Ted Heath in 1970 to 1974. Why am I saying all of this? Well, because right now in the constituency of Makerfield, we have about as close to an opportunity to vote in a by-election to make somebody the Prime Minister as you can get in our system of government. If Andy Burnham is elected on the 18th of June, then the odds of him becoming Prime Minister this year are, in my view, certainly incredibly high. This by-election is therefore very high stakes for Andy Burnham himself, of course, for Keir Starmer as the current Prime Minister, for the Labour Party more broadly, and also for the country. And it's also, and certainly this term gets bandied around a lot at the moment, pretty much unprecedented what's happening. We've been thinking a little bit about what some historic parallels are to the situation in Makerfield. Elsewhere in a different podcast, Danny Finkelstein, the Tory peer, made the comment about William Gladstone in Midlothian in 1880. That wasn't a by-election, but a seat at a general election. And it's a fascinating story in and of itself, centred on a former Prime Minister who effectively has exiled himself. And in order to try and facilitate his return, moves to a new constituency, and a pretty marginal seat at that, to build a platform for returning as Prime Minister. Another possible exception is 1963 with Alec Douglas-Home. In fact, we're going to do a bonus episode soon about this very by-election, because he stands in Kinross and Western Perthshire in an attempt to return to the House of Commons after being in the House of Lords as the Earl of Home. And that's also a fascinating drama. But it all comes after he's been appointed as Prime Minister. So it's really rather different to what we're seeing as well at the moment. It's about maintaining the premiership rather than securing it. That's what victory gives Douglas-Home in that contest.
And what I was thinking about by-elections, which had implications for the leadership of a party and potentially the country, a couple others came to mind. In the 1918 so-called coupon election, there were pretty staggering defeats of significant figures in the parties who were not aligned with the wartime coalition government that then became the post-war coalition government that was led by Lloyd George, but was substantially a conservative government. One of those was Herbert Henry Asquith, who was the leader of the Liberals, who was not aligned with the coalition of Lloyd George. He lost his seat. Ramsay MacDonald, who had been an opponent of the First World War, lost his seat, and he had been the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party before the war and had had to resign as a consequence of his opposition to the First World War. And so you had these two very senior people who had been effectively leaders of their parties turfed out of that election. And in the subsequent parliament, both of them tried to return to parliament through by-elections. Asquith successfully in the Paisley by-election of 1920, and Ramsay MacDonald unsuccessfully in the Woolwich East by-election in 1921. But those by-elections gathered a great deal of attention because these were seen as real stars who were trying to make their way back into Parliament. Not long after these, Winston Churchill tried to make his way back into Parliament. He lost his seat in the 1923 general election, and he stood a by-election in Westminster Abbey in 1924. He was also unsuccessful in that by-election, but there was a huge amount of attention around that by-election because of his celebrity status.
So for seemingly unprecedented events, there are quite a few near parallels. But the one that we've settled on to talk about today is rather more recent. I think importantly, it's also in the context of the Labour Party as well. And it's the 1984 Chesterfield by-election, which sees one of the most prolific post-war Labour MPs, Tony Benn, return to Parliament, having been defeated himself at the general election in 1983. What makes this such a tempting parallel is that there's a reluctance on the part of the party leadership to see this former MP, Tony Benn, return. Benn himself wants to be leader. He stood previously for the Labour leadership. And there is a widespread perception that if he does get back in, then he will try and do so again. And so whilst it's not the Labour Party in government, it is, at least in part, about internal Labour dynamics and how does Labour and how does a Labour leader manage a high-profile figure on the outside who is trying to get back into Parliament to take their job. So, Richard, to kick us off on this theme, why don't we start with Tony Benn's leadership ambitions?
Well, as you mentioned, Lee, both Tony Benn and Andy Burnham clearly were hungry for the Labour leadership, and both men stood for the Labour Party leadership multiple times. In the case of Benn, the first time he went, it was seen as premature. His campaign was seen as unhelpful, and the support that he got was pretty derisory, and it ended up being vaguely humiliating. That was in 1976. We did an episode on this when Harold Wilson resigned as Prime Minister, and Tony Benn put his name forward to stand for the Labour leadership. And Benn's faction, the left of the party, broadly speaking, wanted Michael Foot to be the candidate of the left, against whom they saw as the most likely candidate of the right, probably Jim Callaghan, in that contest. And Benn putting his name forward was seen as a distraction from Michael Foot's campaign. Judith Hart, who was a minister in the Wilson and Callaghan governments, and on the left of the party, an ally of Benn, went to Benn during that leadership campaign, and she pleaded with Benn not to stand for the leadership. She said, "Tony, I love you dearly. I greatly admire you. You must be leader of the party one day, but not now." But the next time that opportunity knocked for Tony Benn, he bottled it. Benn decides in 1980, when he has his best chance really to become Labour leader, not to stand. And Benn argues the reason why he's not going to stand is because he wants the leadership contest to be conducted under different rules. Because by the autumn of 1980, the Labour Party conference had voted in principle to remove the choice of Labour leader from the MPs and to transfer it to some alternative system, which would include representatives of ordinary Labour members and trade union affiliates. But the party conference couldn't agree on a specific formula for how that would be decided. And so the actual final decision was kicked off into the long grass. There would be a special conference in January of 1981 to decide on the new formula. In between party conference and the special conference, Jim Callaghan resigns as leader. And so the leadership contest of 1980 is conducted under the old rules where only the Labour MPs vote for leader. And so Tony Benn, claiming a point of principle, said he would not stand in such a contest because he viewed it to be illegitimate, and he believed that Jim Callaghan should have waited until the party selected its new procedures. A cynic might say that Benn actually fancied his chances better under the new arrangement. And so he was pretty grumpy that Callaghan had absconded the leadership before the new system had come into place.
So the rules do change, but at that stage, Labour has already got a leader who is broadly from the left in Michael Foot, when Michael Foot wins the 1980 leadership election. And so it's not a particularly good moment, really, for somebody like Benn, who is himself on the Labour left, to stand for the leadership. But like you said at the outset, Benn does have this very strong appetite for power within the Labour movement and within the Labour Party itself. And so he sees his chance instead in the deputy leadership contest against Denis Healey. And that's a chance, I guess, where he can test whether or not these new rules are more favourable for him than the old parliamentary processes.
If I'm to be cynical about Benn's intentions, I think Benn might have thought that Denis Healey was going to win under the old rules in November of 1980. And then when the new rules were chosen at the special conference in early 1981, that Benn would then challenge Healey for the Labour leadership, claiming that he was standing for Labour Party democracy under the new rules, and then triumphantly get rid of Denis Healey as leader in the autumn of 1981 party conference. And so it was, much to Benn's surprise and dismay, that the person who won the leadership contest in November 1980 was not Denis Healey on the Labour right, but was Michael Foot on the Labour left. And so when the rules were changed, Benn did announce his intention to stand, but it wasn't to stand against the leader, it was to stand against the deputy leader, because Denis Healey, after losing to Foot in the leadership contest, was then elected by MPs as Labour's deputy leader. And this deputy leadership contest, which we must at some point do an episode on, really, it was an extraordinarily divisive, confrontational contest. It stretched on for months and months and months, because the only time, according to the rules, when a Labour leader could be elected was at party conference, which happened in the autumn. So Benn announces his intentions to stand in the early spring, and he's basically campaigning for months against Healey until they get to party conference. And when they get to party conference, the final vote is extraordinarily close. It's an electoral college system, which means that at that time, 40% of the vote goes to trade union delegates, 30% of the vote goes to delegates representing constituency Labour parties, and 30% of the vote goes to Labour MPs. And because a group of Labour MPs on the left abstained rather than vote for Tony Benn, Denis Healey very, very narrowly won the leadership contest. Benn got 49.6% of the vote. And as Denis Healey, who had quite bushy eyebrows, said, he won by an eyebrow in that contest. Michael Foot was furious with Tony Benn for this campaign. He felt it was an enormous distraction. It was completely self-indulgent. And actually, during the campaign, Foot said, if you believe that the leadership rules are unfair and illegitimate, I was elected under the same leadership rules. So why don't you come for me? Why do you challenge Denis Healey as deputy? Just challenge me as leader. But Benn wouldn't do it because he didn't want a left versus left contest. He wanted a left versus right contest because he thought he could win. And people were so annoyed by the people on the left. Some people on the left were so annoyed by the sense that this was a vanity run that basically cost him the deputy leadership.
So I think that's important context to get us towards 1983, 1984. You've got a divided party. You've got a fair few ambitious people milling around. It's worth also saying very talented people. These are not people for whom there's no great service that they bring to the party or to the country. Right? These are very impressive politicians of their era, but they're dramatically fragmented within the party and fiercely divided about the future. I think it's also clear underlying that as well that Benn, under the new rules, probably does command enough support to win a head-to-head battle, providing he doesn't let his own ego, some may say, sense of entitlement, get in the way. It's very striking that it isn't the right that prevents Benn from winning that contest. the right does what the right has always expected to do within the Labour Party. They vote against Benn, whether that's the right in the parliamentary party or the right in the country. It's the refusal of Labour MPs who are broadly on the left to support him and abstain. I think Neil Kinnock, in fact, is one of those who abstains in that contest.
He does, and he's called a Judas for doing so.
So it's interesting that it's an inability to hold his own sort of wing of the party together that is becoming Benn's undoing. But what undoes his progression to the top even more is the 1983 general election. So it is a landslide win at the national level for Margaret Thatcher. She gets a majority of over 140 seats in the House of Commons. Staggeringly good result. And Tony Benn is one of the high-profile victims of Thatcher's landslide. It's maybe worth saying at the get-go, he wasn't the only high-profile victim of it. Other people like Shirley Williams, the former education minister, she lost her seat in Crosby that she had won previously in a by-election. One of the other founders of the SDP, Bill Rogers, he lost the new constituency of Stockton North as well. In fact, he came third in that result. So he wasn't the only big name to lose at the hands of the Conservatives in 1983, but certainly his defeat was one of the standout moments. In terms of why it happened, it's often said that it was because of boundary changes. So 1983 was one of the big boundary change elections when many of the constituencies changed. And for the benefit of international listeners, particularly in the United States, it is worth saying that whilst there is some capacity for governments to set the criteria that the Boundary Commission will work to, boundary changes to parliamentary constituencies is done through an independent process. It is not some sort of appalling gerrymandering process, as you sometimes see in other parts of the world. But nevertheless, it does have winners and it does have losers. You can move areas of a constituency as benignly as you like. Somebody will benefit, somebody will lose very often. And Tony Benn's old constituency of Bristol South East, which is worth saying, was already a pretty marginal constituency. He'd won it by less than 2,000 votes in the 1979 general election. But it basically went two ways. There was a new Bristol South and a new Bristol East constituency. Bristol South was seen to be the better one for Labour, and in fact Benn did want to stand in Bristol South, but he ended up being pipped to the post for that selection against a now pretty forgotten Labour MP called Michael Cox, but who had the benefit at the time of being the chief whip in the Labour Party. So quite useful, I think, for times like this, when you're plotting your way to getting a good seat. But nevertheless, Benn then stands in Bristol East. And the reason why I think boundary changes, in fact, are not the full story of his defeat is that the notional result in Bristol East is actually slightly better for Labour than the notional result in his old Bristol South East constituency. So whereas you won it by less than 2,000, the notional figures for the new boundaries says that Labour would have won it by just over 4,000. So it's not that the boundary changes take him out in and of itself, but basically the long and short of it is Tony Benn is representing a part of the seat that in a close election would be Labour, but in a Tory landslide is going to be won by the Conservatives. And that's what happens. He loses his seat to the Conservatives. He gets just over 18,000 votes, and the Conservative candidate, Jonathan Sayeed, gets just under 20,000 votes. And Benn is out of Parliament.
It was actually anticipated that Benn would lose his seat in that general election, and there were offers for him to relocate to safer seats. I believe there was a Scottish Labour MP who basically offered his safe seat up for Benn to take it, and Benn refused. It's an insight into the curious, sometimes self-destructive streak that Tony Benn had, where if he just played his political cards a little bit more cannily, he might have done better politically than he ended up doing. But he insisted that, in effect, he would go down with the ship in Bristol East, which is exactly what happened.
It's interesting in the election night coverage, you can hear that sense of going down with the ship, because Benn says in his concession speech, nothing but the defeat of the voters would have compelled me to leave Bristol, basically. So that he very much saw it as being the noble thing to do, to stand in this seat, which, lest we forget, he'd represented since 1950 in Parliament, with the brief gap of when he was thrown out of the House of Commons, when he inherited his father's viscountcy in the early 1960s. So this is a very long-standing association that Tony Benn has with Bristol, and not one he was willing to relinquish lightly. But nevertheless, he's out of the House of Commons. And although he would also say in his concession speech that he thought that his own commitment and service to the Labour movement could be discharged as well outside of Parliament as inside of Parliament. Clearly, that's not true in lots of ways. There's things that only an MP can do within a party. And also, as the story will expose, he also didn't really think that was true, hence his desire to come back. But Richard, for a brief period, all the same, he is in exile. And that therefore means that the leadership election that follows the 1983 general election defeat is going to take place without Tony Benn being a candidate, at least if Michael Foot chooses to go sooner rather than later.
Yes, so if we're taking the sort of cynical read of Benn's motivations, after losing the 1981 deputy leadership contest by an eyebrow, he probably takes the view he can't challenge Michael Foot. That wouldn't look good because the left would see him as turning on a figure of the left. So what he'd have to do is wait until Michael Foot resigned the Labour leadership. And then when there was a vacancy, that Benn would manoeuvre for himself to be effectively the representative of the left of the party. And in a traditional left-right battle, this time he would hope win the contest under Labour's new electoral college rules. Of course, losing his seat in 1983 complicates this because, as Andy Burnham is experiencing right now, if you are not an MP, you are not eligible for the leadership of the Labour Party. Now, what I think is really interesting about what happens after the 1983 general election is how quickly Michael Foot resigns as party leader. Just days after the general election, Foot announces that he will resign as Labour leader and he will stand down once the party conference elects his successor in the autumn. And, these days, I think we're quite accustomed to the idea that if a party leader loses a general election, that they resign very quickly, sometimes within a matter of days or within a matter of weeks. Usually by the time of the next party conference, a new leader is in place or about to come into place. There are a few exceptions in the 21st century. Jeremy Corbyn staying on after the 2017 general election, of course, is an exception to that. But in the 20th century, it was more common that a defeated leader would hang on for an undisclosed period of time. In 1979, Jim Callaghan loses the general election to Margaret Thatcher in May of 1979. He does not leave as Labour leader until November of 1980. That's 18 months where he is leader of the opposition. Callaghan did this deliberately. It was a strategic move to try to help Denis Healey win the leadership. Callaghan's view was he wanted to be succeeded by Healey, but Healey had made himself very unpopular with some Labour MPs because of his stringent economic policies trying to bring down inflation during the Callaghan Labour government when Healey was Chancellor. And so he wanted Healey to have a year and a half to try and butter up Labour MPs, to get them back on side, and to make himself effectively more popular by opposing the Thatcher government as Shadow Chancellor, rather than having to defend the policies of an unpopular Labour Chancellor. And the way that Callaghan put it to Healey was to use a cricket metaphor, where he said that he would stay on as leader for 18 months, quote, to take the shine off the ball. Well, it didn't quite go as planned, as Healey later wrote, Jim's last 18 months not only took the shine off the ball, but ripped away the leather as well. Because actually what happened in the 18 months of Callaghan's leadership was not that the Labour Party came together with a common objective of defeating Margaret Thatcher and opposing the Thatcher government, but it was an 18 months of recriminations against those who were defenders of the past Labour government versus those who argued that the previous Labour government had been a betrayal of socialism and everything the Labour Party believed in. So that did not help Denis Healey ultimately win the Labour leadership. Foot, in contrast, doesn't wait around. And I have to think that part of it is because he knows that Benn is out of Parliament. Although Benn and Foot were both on the left of centre in the Labour Party, they had fallen out during Foot's leadership. Foot was extremely incensed by Benn's challenge of Healey, because not only was it a challenge of Healey, but Foot believed that it was undermining the Labour Party's ability to put a united front against Margaret Thatcher, and Labour basically lost a year of infighting over the deputy leadership. So he viewed Benn as self-indulgent and overly ambitious. And so he moved quickly to cause a Labour leadership election before Benn had a chance to get back into Parliament. And Foot put forward, in effect, as his chosen successor, his protege, a young MP from Wales in the bordering constituency to Foot's constituency, Neil Kinnock. And Kinnock had shown himself to be a very effective communicator. He was seen to be smart. He was seen to be energetic. One of Foot's problems was he was seen to be a bit old and doddery and a bit past it. He looked older than he even was. Whereas Kinnock, although he had a receding hairline, God bless him, was of a different generation. Kinnock was remembered at the 1983 election, at the eve of the election, by giving this famous speech against Margaret Thatcher, where he said, "If Margaret Thatcher wins on Thursday, I warn you not to be ordinary. I warn you not to be young. I warn you not to fall ill. I warn you not to get old." And it was really sort of lapped up by the Labour Party. They loved it, absolutely loved it. The Labour right was in more disarray. Healey had been damaged by the deputy leadership contest, because although he defeated Benn, he did not defeat him decisively at all. I mean, it was really just thanks to the fact that some soft left Labour MPs betrayed Tony Benn, as Benn would see it, in those final moments that Healey held on to the deputy leadership. And also, Healey was only just 4 years younger than Foot. He'd been an MP since the early 50s. He'd been in government since the mid-1960s. And so the right needed someone who was a fresh face. Unfortunately for the right, many of the potential fresh faces had left the party. They'd gone and joined the SDP. I always maintain that if Shirley Williams had not joined the SDP, she would have been a very credible candidate for the Labour right in the 1983 leadership contest, and I think could have given Neil Kinnock a bit more of a run for his money in that contest, but she had betrayed the Labour Party. So instead, the right of the Labour Party had to put forward someone who was of a younger generation, but had some experience to bear and was seen as a reasonably effective communicator. And they landed on Roy Hattersley, who I think is an intelligent man, but is not a tub-thumping speaker quite in the same way that Neil Kinnock was. And Hattersley made this rather curious decision to stand both for leader and deputy leader. And so there was basically a view that developed over the course of the Labour leadership contest that the party's unity ticket would be Kinnock for leader and Hattersley for deputy. And that's basically what the unions decided amongst themselves, that they would throw their weight behind Kinnock at the leadership ballot, and then they would throw their weight behind Hattersley in the deputy leadership ballot. There were other people who stood. Peter Shaw, the former cabinet minister, stood for leader, but did very poorly. And the Socialist Campaign Group, which was the kind of continuity group of Bennism, as it was becoming the harder left of the Labour Party, the acolytes of Tony Benn, put forward Eric Heffer to be effectively the stand-in for Tony Benn in that contest, but he received a derisory 6% of the vote, which demonstrated that Bennism without Benn had limited appeal. So poor old Tony Benn, sitting on the sidelines, could only watch helplessly as Neil Kinnock romped to victory, securing 71% of the overall Electoral College vote on the first ballot and becoming leader of the Labour Party.
So the by-election is going to take place in 1984. What is Benn doing in this brief period, relatively brief period, from the 83 general election until his chance to make a comeback?
Well, Benn does feel quite bereft. He's been an MP since 1950, with that exception when he becomes a Viscount and is disqualified from the Commons and then fights his way back. But he's effectively been a full-time parliamentarian for 33 years at that point. And now he's at a loose end. Ben was a bit of a workaholic, and so it was quite difficult, I think, for him to go from operating at this high speed to nothing. Ralph Miliband, the father of Ed Miliband and a personal friend of Tony Benn, in fact, Ralph arranges for his young son, Ed Miliband, to become an intern in Tony Benn's office in the 1990s, says to the left-wing intellectual Tariq Ali, Tony is so depressed, we should do something to cheer him up. And so what Benn does to cheer himself up is he travels. He first goes to Hiroshima, an unusual place perhaps to try and cheer yourself up. But he finds this to be a very moving and meaningful trip for him, and it solidifies his sense of the evils of nuclear weapons and his commitment to nuclear disarmament. Then he and his wife, Caroline, fly to Cuba, where they are desperately trying to make arrangements to have a meeting with Fidel Castro. The idea of meeting the Comandante, Benn said, made the pair, quote, as excited as a couple of kids would be at the prospect of Santa coming down the chimney. A meeting was arranged, but sadly, at the last minute, their plans were thwarted by the wicked American imperialists who had invaded Grenada, Cuba's ally in the Caribbean, and therefore distracting Castro, who had to cancel the meeting to focus on the military situation in the Caribbean and worries that if the United States were going to topple a left-wing government in one Caribbean island, could he be next? So it's a bit of a disappointment to them. But after the trip to Cuba, Benn returns to England and he goes to a funeral in Bristol. And it's while he's in Bristol that he meets the successfully elected MP for Bristol South, the aforementioned Michael Cox. Cox is now shadow chief whip. And although Cox was on the right of the party, he and Neil Kinnock didn't get along. He believed that Kinnock, who of course wasn't on the right, was on the left of the party, was scheming to try and remove him from his position as shadow chief whip. And so in that old political adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, he tips off Tony Benn that there's a by-election coming round the corner in a coal mining seat of Chesterfield. It's going to be the first by-election of Neil Kinnock's leadership. And the incumbent MP there, Eric Varley, a former cabinet minister who Benn knew well, had sat around the cabinet table with, but was on the right of the Labour Party, was about to resign, and a vacancy was going to come about in Chesterfield. And Tony Benn might think about putting his hat into the ring.
Varley isn't a well-known figure now, but he was in the cabinet as Secretary of State for Industry under both Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan, and in opposition also came really quite high on the shadow cabinet ballots for that old, rather peculiar way that the Labour Party would vote for who would make its shadow cabinet, and then the leader would get to appoint the individual roles, but the actual question of who would be in the shadow cabinet was decided by the parliamentary party en masse, and Varley would often come pretty high on the ballot. So he was a notable figure at the time, even if not quite today. So why does he decide, Richard, that he actually wants to leave Parliament? What's his rationale?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Varley and Benn had held the same cabinet positions in the 70s. When Benn was Industry Secretary, Varley was Energy Secretary, and then when Benn was Energy Secretary, Varley was Industry Secretary. Varley was a working class MP, indisputably. He was from Chesterfield. He'd left school at 13. He had worked in a factory throughout his teen years and into his early 20s. He then rose up through the union ranks, through the National Union of Mine Workers, became a Labour MP, that traditional working class route. But he was not a man who had a great deal of money or came from a great deal of wealth. And basically he was offered a directorship of a company called Coline. And he made the decision that he'd been in the cabinet, he'd served his time in government, didn't look like Labour was going to be back in power anytime soon. And so why not make the jump to a well-remunerated office? It's not something that I praise MPs for doing, but it's not unheard of that MPs, particularly those who believe that the party is not going in the direction that they want to see it going in anytime soon, jump at the chance of working in private industry, and that's what Varley did.
I mentioned before that you can see in the election night coverage Tony Benn's concession speech, and just after it, David Dimbleby picks up on the fact that when Ben says, "Nothing but the defeat of the voters could have compelled me to leave Bristol," he's effectively hinting that now that he's being defeated by the voters, he may very well leave Bristol. And David Dimbleby, in fact, half predicts that he will try and find a different constituency elsewhere. But as Andy Burnham can, in fact, definitely attest after his own experiences in the last 6 months or so, the path back to Parliament in a by-election is really in two parts. It's, yes, ultimately a question about winning the support of the voters. But before that, it's a question of winning the support of the party to be the party's candidate. And that can, in fact, sometimes be the much trickier task. So how does Ben go about doing that?
Well, Chesterfield is a seat that has a strong mining sector. And so the National Union of Mine Workers was very powerful in the seat. And in those days, parliamentary selections were done by delegates of both rank and file Labour members, but also union representatives. And so if there was a union that was particularly well represented in the workforce in that constituency, that union would have a powerful influence in the selection of the MP. So after the funeral, where Michael Cox reveals that Varley is going, Ben rings up Arthur Scargill, the president of the National Union of Mine Workers, who we've talked about in a recent podcast. And he asks Scargill, "Do you think I have a chance in getting selected in Chesterfield?" Scargill rings up his NUM contacts in Chesterfield and reports back to Ben, "Yes, you have a chance, but it's not sewn up. It's going to be a fight. You're going to have to fight really hard for this seat." And so Ben picks up the challenge and commits himself to going round all of the branches of the constituency Labour Party. In those days, you'd have, within a constituency Labour Party, you'd have multiple branches. Each of those branches would nominate a particular candidate who they want to see selected on the shortlist. There would also be trade union branches for different employers in the constituency. They would make nominations for who they wanted to be selected. And each of those would have a meeting, often in a union hall or sometimes in someone's living room. And Ben kept going up and down from London to Chesterfield to speak at these meetings. On one occasion, Ben's train missed the station. And so desperate was Ben not to be late for the selection meeting that Ben actually leaped out of the train and walked the rest of the way down the train tracks back to Chesterfield to get to the selection meeting. The Kinnock leadership did not want Ben back in Parliament. And the reason for that, of course, was that Ben had shown himself to be disloyal to the leadership when he stood against Dennis Healey in 1981. And Kinnock did not want to see Ben standing against him, or indeed Ben standing against Roy Hattersley in a remake of the 1981 deputy leadership contest. It's not clear how much Kinnock tried to block Ben, but Ben, who at this point was serving on the National Executive Committee, he'd been elected as a constituency rank and file Labour delegate to the NEC, was bandying about accusations that the leadership was trying to stitch him up. And there is some evidence that suggests that was the case, because in January of 1984, when the executive committee of the Chesterfield Labour Party announced the shortlist, Ben wasn't on it. And Ben rings up his friend Dennis Skinner, who's a former miner and a kind of miners MP, a NUM member in the Labour Party in Parliament. And Skinner gets his contacts in Chesterfield basically to overturn the decision of the executive committee through what's called the General Management Committee of the local Labour Party, but basically gets Ben put on the shortlist. So I think there is a bit of an Andy Burnham parallel here, where the leadership initially tries to block Ben from being on the shortlist. They succeed initially, and then they basically succumb to party pressure. Now, in the Ben case, it's truncated, it all happens in a week and for the same seat. But a similar dynamic, I suppose you could say, was at play for Andy Burnham. There's then a selection meeting, and Ben goes up against some other really credible candidates, including the Labour leader on the local council, who comes from a mining background. And you have people basically who are standing for that seat who are local, come out of the industries that the members work in. So Ben is very much a sort of fish out of water in that respect. But Ben is a celebrity and is well known within the Labour Party. And he gives his selection speech. Rather ominously, during the selection speech, in Ben's terms, very large man collapses in the middle of Ben's speech and suffers an epileptic fit. The man then has to be dragged away by some other members. He's this larger man, so it's not an easy thing to do. And Ben makes sure that he's timed exactly the amount of time that it's taken between the collapse of that man and the time that he gets back to his speech, to make sure that he's not at any disadvantage in terms of time relative to the other candidates. Ben does not win on the first ballot. It takes 3 ballots for Ben to win the selection, but he is ultimately selected as the Labour candidate for Chesterfield in the first by-election of Neil Kinnock's leadership.
So a much harder selection for Ben than for Burnham. In Burnham's case, he was the only candidate that the NEC put on the shortlist for Makerfield, having, of course, declined to put him on a shortlist previously in Gorton and Denton. But if Burnham's big challenge is winning the popular vote in the constituency on polling day, then that's a much more foregone conclusion for Tony Benn in Chesterfield. This was a much safer seat for Labour than Bristol East, where Benn had been defeated. Even in 1983, Labour got just under half of the vote in Chesterfield. And I think it'd be fair to say, Richard, that at no stage did people really doubt that Labour would retain this seat. But that doesn't mean that the campaign itself is without difficulty, not least because, as you've just said, you've got people within the Labour leadership and around the Labour leadership who do not like the idea of Tony Benn returning to Parliament. But you don't want to be seen almost to discourage or wish ill upon one of your party's own candidates in a by-election, not least because, whilst there may be some benefit to Neil Kinnock if Ben was defeated, given Ben's ambitions to lead the party and the obvious threat that's inherent in that for Kinnock. Nevertheless, it would also reflect very poorly on Kinnock for the first by-election of his leadership to be a Labour loss and a gain for somebody else. So how does the Labour hierarchy handle this pretty tricky situation?
You're exactly right, Lee. Kinnock does not want to sabotage Benn's candidacy because he wants to make sure that Labour gets a good win in his first by-election. It's his first electoral test as leader. There haven't even been local elections yet. So it carries that much more significant import for Kinnock's own leadership. At the same time, he doesn't really want to see Tony Benn back in Parliament, at least not so soon. And so the Labour leadership makes the decision that the best thing that they can do in this by-election is to hug Tony Benn really close. So Kinnock goes to Benn and says that the full weight of the Labour Party machinery will be put behind Benn's campaign, that the campaign's communications and leaflets and organisation will be run by the Labour Party centrally. On the one hand, that sounds like Benn's wings are being massively clipped. Why would Benn agree to that? Well, on the other hand, you have to think, well, what other choice does Benn really have? Because he doesn't have some kind of external support in quite the same way. He does try to use people who are more on his political wavelength to help him. He leans on some people who are working in Ken Livingstone's GLC, Greater London Council at the time, who he brings up to help him with communications. But basically, the Central Labour Party runs the by-election, as is consistent with most by-election campaigns. But what's even more dramatic is the tone and tenor that the Labour leadership take in this contest. So Kinnock goes up to Chesterfield to campaign for Tony Benn, and he says to the press in the contest, on all the essential areas of policy, I don't think there is any disagreement between us. Dennis Healey, who of course Benn had challenged for the deputy leadership. Healey is at the time Shadow Foreign Secretary. He's no longer deputy leader. He's been replaced by Roy Hattersley, but he's still a very senior figure on the Labour right. Makes a point of going to Chesterfield and campaigning with Tony Benn. The two men go to a local pub, probably a more natural habitat for Healy than Benn, given that Healy liked to drink and Benn was a teetotaler. Healy, who was a talented pianist, gets on the piano at the pub and starts playing a song called Jolly Good Company, in which the two men are singing this 1930s song, which has the refrain in it, "Here we are again, happy as can be, all good pals and jolly good company." And at another event, at this same visit, Dennis Healy cheers on Tony Benn and says, "Tony without Dennis would be like Torval without Dean," which is a very 1980s reference. It's a reference to the gold-winning ice skaters at the 1984 Winter Olympics, which had just happened, which was sort of the pride of Britain at the time. And just as Healy makes these remarks, rather ominously, the party banner behind him comes crashing to the floor. But both Healy and Benn make great light of this, and everyone finds it very funny. So there is this real display of unity from across the Labour Party, from the left to the right of the Labour Party, behind Tony Benn in the Chesterfield by-election.
And then when the result happens, it is the Labour win that people expect. So Tony Benn gets just under 25,000 votes, so 46.5% of the poll. Interestingly, the second place Conservatives from the general election plummet. Their vote more than halves to end up in third place. The Conservative candidate in that contest was Nick Bourne, who had stood in the 1983 contest as well. Nick Bourne, as it happens, is now a member of the House of Lords and would go on to be a Conservative member of the Welsh Parliament as well. And really, the person who has a very good performance, although it seems to be at the expense of the Conservatives rather than Benn or Labour, is somebody called Max Payne. I don't know what happened to him, who was the Liberal candidate whose vote share went up to more than a third of the vote. So, Richard, I think on the face of it, the result is not particularly remarkable. It's the Labour win. There's some curiosity further down the ballot for the Liberals and the Conservatives. But what actually really stands out about the ballot is that there are 12 independent candidates who range from getting 7 votes, that's poor John Connell, who finishes bottom of the poll, to 116 votes for a David Bentley. And in between, 11 others who just get a dozen or a couple of dozen votes apiece. It's not a key part of the story, but what on earth is going on there?
Well, I do think there's something quite interesting there. As you say, 12 independent candidates. There's also a Monster Raving Looney candidate. There's also someone who stands as an independent Labour candidate. In those days, the deposit to stand for Parliament was £150. Now, in today's money, that's over £600. So it's more than it costs to stand for Parliament today, which is £500. You have to put it, for people who don't know, if you want to stand for Parliament, one of the things you have to do is you have to pay a deposit to the local authority. If you get more than 5% of the vote, you get your money back. In those days, it was £150, and you had to get 12.5% of the vote. But clearly that wasn't a deterrent for those independents. And it's rather interesting that just the following year, the Thatcher government changes the law and raises the deposit amount from £150 to £500. But it's never been changed with inflation. So the reason we pay £500 today is because that was the amount set 40 years ago, and no one's changed it with inflation. If you updated that amount with inflation, to stand for Parliament today, you would be asked to pay over £2,000. And it's a rather interesting thing because we now do get lots of minor party candidates standing for Parliament. Some people might say, well, let 1,000 flowers bloom, that's fine. But others might say, well, it's maybe a distraction from the serious candidates, and it causes people to stand for Parliament for the sake of vanity. They also get to deliver a piece of literature to everyone in the constituency for free, which actually means that it's quite costly for the taxpayer, each candidate who stands, because it's more than £500 to send a bit of post to every single household in the constituency. So I've not heard anyone suggest that we revisit the size of the deposit, but I think that the deposit was partly raised because you were getting these kind of really long ballots happening in the mid-1980s.
So Benn gets back into Parliament. He achieves his goal after this brief interregnum. And there he would spend the next 18 years. So he stays as the MP for Chesterfield until 2001 and has this really remarkable career in many, many respects. Obviously, given what we've said, it ends up totaling about half a century as a parliamentarian. Not all that many people have managed to do that. One of my favourite little curiosities about Tony Benn is that he stands in a staggering number of by-elections. So in fact, he stands in 3 by-elections in Bristol. He's first elected in a by-election in 1950. He twice contests by-elections when he's trying to fight to get his seat back when his father dies and he gets the peerage that he then successfully disclaims. And then he fights his by-election Chesterfield as well. I mean, he has more by-elections under his belt than it's sort of imaginable anybody to really have, certainly in the second half of the 20th century.
Since Churchill.
Yeah, Churchill fights more than his fair share as well. And then when he's back, how big a thorn in the side is he for Neil Kinnock and his leadership?
Well, all that warmth that Benn felt from the shadow cabinet during the by-election quickly turned quite frosty on his return to Parliament. Basically, Kinnock tried to freeze Benn out, and there was no real attempt by Kinnock to elevate Benn in any way. Of course, as you mentioned, Lee, in those days, putting someone in the shadow cabinet was not the exclusive gift of the leader. So Kinnock could not just appoint Tony Benn into the shadow cabinet. He had to stand in the shadow cabinet elections, which he did, but he did not rank highly enough on the ballot, which shows that I think there were still quite a few Labour MPs who felt quite bitter about the behaviour of Tony Benn in the Michael Foot leadership years. Benn is not impressed with Kinnock's leadership. We think of Neil Kinnock today as one of the great orators of his generation. I certainly view him in that way. Still today, Kinnock is a very engaging and animating speaker now that he's well into his 80s. I went to see him speak last year at an event at the Senate House in London, and he was on a panel with, I wouldn't say who it was, but another member of the cabinet, current member of the cabinet, and a couple of political commentators. And easily, Kinnock was still the most interesting and engaging and entertaining speaker. But there was actually a perception when Kinnock was leader that he was a bit boring. He was, I think, very unkindly called the Welsh windbag. Benn wrote in his diaries, Kinnock's interviews are like processed cheese coming out of a mincing machine. Nothing meaty, just a mass of meaningless rhetoric that diffuses and anaesthetizes the listener. Barbara Castle, who at that time was a Labour MEP, a Eurosceptic Labour MEP, I should say, wrote that Kinnock's advisors were making him look like a bank clerk who just couldn't make an impromptu speech. She said he wasn't breathing the oxygen he so desperately needed. In spite of that complaint that Benn was making, he recognized that he had no chance standing against Kinnock, at least at that stage in Kinnock's leadership. He confided in his diaries, the last thing we want is a row with Kinnock because he is still on his honeymoon. And so he doesn't, in spite of perhaps Kinnock's fears, he doesn't challenge Kinnock for the leadership, and he doesn't challenge Roy Hattersley for the deputy leadership either. And part of that might be because Kinnock was lucky with events, because just 2 weeks after the Chesterfield by-election, the NUM go out on strike. The miners' strike of 1984 begins, and Benn's Chesterfield constituency is at the heart of that struggle. And Benn throws himself into the miners' strike and positions himself very clearly as a friend of the NUM miners, as a friend of the striking miners. And that really takes up his attention for the coming year. And in a way, Benn regards his activities supporting the miners as more important than standing in a quixotic leadership contest or deputy leadership contest. He eventually does stand for Labour leader, but not for years, not until 1988, after Labour loses the 1987 general election, and Kinnock stays on as Labour leader. And in my view, Kinnock stays on as Labour leader at the sufferance of the Labour right. Kinnock, of course, had been on the left, but I think his second term as leader, shall we say, from 1987 to 1992, Kinnock is now basically conceding the policy of the Labour Party to the Labour right. He implements his policy review, which changes the policies of the Labour Party in quite profound ways, in ways which he had not tried to do in the first 4 years of his leadership. When it becomes clear to Benn that the Labour right are basically in the driving seat now of the leadership, even though the leadership is nominally in the hands of someone on the left, Benn tries to get rid of Kinnock in 1988. But by this point, Benn is seen as too eccentric, too far out of the Labour mainstream. The challenge to Kinnock is strongly resisted by the Labour right, who fall in line behind Kinnock, and also those elements of the soft left, who basically feel that Benn's stance against Kinnock is another vanity campaign, and Benn loses miserably. So really, Tony Benn's best chance of becoming Labour leader, in my view, would have been in 1983, and that's the one time when he wasn't eligible because he wasn't in Parliament.
Well, something of encouraging news there then for Keir Starmer in a month in which he's had very little cause to cheer. Certainly if Andy Burnham gets in Makerfield, I think we can say that it won't be 4 years on the other side of a general election before there's the next Labour leadership contest. Certainly doesn't feel that way at the moment anyway. But Richard, to wrap this episode up, we spoke at the outset and have peppered it in a little bit throughout, that it is the events currently going on in Makerfield that prompted us to discuss this. So what do you think the lessons of Tony Benn's return in Chesterfield are for Andy Burnham and perhaps for Keir Starmer, if there are any at all?
Well, I think what it shows is that politics, timing is, if not everything, extremely important. And Benn misses his moment. He could have stood in a safer seat in 1983, but he chose not to do so. And then at the moment of opening for the leadership, he's not there. And I think you can draw something of a comparison with Andy Burnham. Andy Burnham could have stood in the 2024 general election. Of course, he was already mayor of Greater Manchester, but maybe he could have anticipated that Keir Starmer actually wasn't a great Labour leader. I never thought that he was basically someone who benefited enormously from the collapse of the Conservative Party, but I didn't really think Starmer showed particular talents as leader himself. There were periods of time during Starmer's leadership when Labour was doing very badly, when Labour lost Hartlepool in a by-election, when Boris Johnson was leader of the Conservative Party. But Burnham did not put himself forward, and Burnham was therefore not in Parliament at the moment of Starmer's greatest moment of vulnerability. Now, Burnham, like Benn, may return to Parliament, and I would argue, obviously, Starmer is in a much more damaged position than Neil Kinnock was in 1984. Kinnock was still in his honeymoon. He'd just been elected Labour leader on that enormous 71% of the vote, and I think many people wanted to give Kinnock a good run of things. If Burnham returns to Parliament in June, and there's a much bigger if over that than there was for Tony Benn's return, because as you say, Lee, Makerfield is now much more politically vulnerable for Labour than Chesterfield was in 1984. The timing may be off. Okay, Burnham may immediately put his name forward to stand against Starmer, but already 6 weeks will have passed since the local elections, and Starmer, I think, is already somewhat strengthening his position, at least relative to where he was then. Then you might have a contested leadership contest, and that means that there'll be even more time before Labour members finally make a decision as to who they want as leader. And there have been some very recent polls of Labour members which suggest that actually Starmer has more of a fighting chance for the leadership than I certainly would have anticipated only a couple of months ago. And so, by virtue of not being in Parliament at the key moment for Burnham in May of 2026, for Benn in the summer of 1983, even though they come back just a bit after that moment, by the virtue of missing that moment, maybe their time has already passed. Time will tell.
The only thing I would add to that is that, of course, politics, and certainly climbing up the ladder in politics, is full of gambles. And in Benn's case, partly what he gambled on, I would say, is to stand and try and win in Bristol. That because he was expected to lose, well, if he had managed to win, even amidst this Thatcher landslide, then that would have really boosted his credentials for the leadership. Similarly, Burnham gambled on the idea that he could go and become mayor of Greater Manchester and come back at a time that would work for climbing up to the top of the Labour Party at the third time of asking. And in many ways, that, of course, has worked for him. Burnham's reputation is higher than ever after having spent almost a decade as mayor of Greater Manchester. But those gambles also come with downside risks, and both of them have found them out, I think, in a very severe way. Like you say, time will tell just whether or not Burnham gets his second chance. We finished by discussing some books that we're reading at the moment. I'll go first. So this past week, I happened to pop into the Bodleian at the University of Oxford, which is where they have a huge number of books. It's a library, but also a great many archives as well. And whilst I was there, I happened to look in some of the Harold Wilson papers and stumbled across the notes he was taking for a television series and a book called A Prime Minister on Prime Ministers, which he wrote at the end of the 1970s, very shortly after leaving Downing Street. Well, I have a couple of observations on it. One, it's an interesting form for a book. So it's not too dissimilar in some ways to the book that Harold Macmillan wrote, The Past Masters, where he's basically taking his own political experience to cast an eye over the careers of other politicians. This goes rather further back. It goes back to William Pitt the Younger, goes back to Robert Peel and Palmerston, whereas Macmillan focuses much more on politicians who we knew and saw perform in the flesh. But nevertheless, I'm quite enjoying reading bits of this book. A criticism I would offer is that Wilson is one of those people who I think is more enjoyable to listen to than he is to read. I think Wilson's writing is turgid, is so unkind a thing to say, but it isn't engrossing, really, in the way that you would hope, and certainly not in the way that Wilson as a speaker could be, and not just at his best, really, throughout much of his career. And so my plea, actually, having come across in the Bodleian the transcript of the interview for the TV series that accompanied this book. So the format of the television series was that Wilson would be interviewed by David Frost in these different locations, talking about the lives of these politicians. So in the case of Stanley Baldwin, he's interviewed at Harrow, the school that Baldwin went to, and also at Chequers. And reading the transcripts was actually in many ways more interesting than reading the book, partly because the transcripts are unedited, so you can see the mistakes that they make and the re-records that they do, but also just because Wilson does have this greater flow in speech that I think he often lacks in his writing. So I think we should strongly encourage them to broadcast A Prime Minister on Prime Ministers by Harold Wilson from back in 1977. They definitely still have the footage because about 20 odd years ago, they released a DVD of it. But as I don't know anybody who owns a DVD player now, it's neither use nor ornament to most people. Richard, what are you reading this week?
This week, I read Resisting Reagan, Liberal Strategies in a Conservative Age by Joe Ryan Hume. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book with Mark Garnett and Gavin Hyman about the history of the Labour Party in opposition called Keeping the Red Flag Flying. And the central argument of our book was that opposition is not just dead time between government. It is, in some ways, a more fortuitous time for parties to refresh, renew, grow, and change. And we felt that the Labour Party experienced some of its most profound changes, not while it's in government, but when it's in opposition. Well, Joe Ryan Hume in this book has looked at liberals, and in particular the Democrats, in the 1980s during the Reagan era. And Ryan Hume identifies how liberalism in America as a kind of political project changes profoundly in the Reagan era. It is a decade where liberalism sheds some of its associations with the centrality of class as a unifying part of the project to the sort of New Deal coalition that Franklin Roosevelt had brought about, to seeing liberalism as about championing different identities. Ryan Hume talks about this as the moment when identity politics becomes central to American liberalism. And that, I mean, even if you go back to the 1960s, you look at the civil rights struggle, which of course is a struggle for racial equality, so much of the civil rights struggle is also put in class terms. I mean, the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech, is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And basically it's a union march. It's organized effectively by the unions. And by the 80s, the Democratic Party and liberals are seeing association with the unions and class politics as a bit passé. And the Democratic Party and liberals throw themselves in with the politics of nuclear disarmament, of feminism, of different ethnic and racial groups, of immigrant rights, the gay rights movement, and so on. And in many ways, it's the making of the Democratic Party as we come to have known it even today. And one of the things that's quite remarkable about the book, I think, is that it ties this work of history with the long-running political legacies of that transformation in the 1980s. As it happens, I think this was disastrous for American liberalism, and American liberalism should have maintained the centrality of class. But it's understandable why, particularly in a country like the United States, which is a country that is riven by so many other divisions, including race, which I do believe is a central division in American politics. It's very much in my own research central, that you can see why other forms of identity become very important to the liberal project. So if you're interested in any of that, the book is Resisting Reagan by Joe Ryan Hume.
We'll have links to those books in the show notes, but that's all for this episode. As ever, a quick reminder that if you enjoy listening to the podcast, please do leave a review wherever you get your podcast from. The more stars you leave, the happier we'll be. Also, that you can support the podcast and listen to it ad-free on our Patreon. There's a link for that in the show notes as well. And then we'll be back on Thursday with our next Matters of Interest. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.